Alrighty. Okay, sorry about the slight delay there. Having some technical difficulties with my microphone and this laptop for some reason. I don't know why. I used my other laptop yesterday and it worked perfectly, so I might have to switch them. Okay, so welcome back. So obviously this is Sociology 366. People in industry. I know I've seen the kind of the numbers for the course kind of slowly rising. So if you're new to the class, welcome. This is my kind of Q&A system. It's called Slido. So you can log in using that QR code or oh, that's a funny question. Use that QR code and all that jazz. Okay, are the lectures live streamed or just posted on YouTube? No, everything is live streamed. Okay. Is this class basically an advanced version of Social 10 from the Alberta curriculum? No. Once we get into it, and if you look at the themes that are on the syllabus, this class is very much focused on one particular field, which is work and industry. So, I mean, we're getting kind of through some of the basic history. In the next unit, we're going to go through some social theories that relate to work in a fair bit of depth. So I know, yeah, some of this stuff on like industrialization, I know is very much like stuff you've seen before, but we're just getting that sort of baseline, and then we're going to veer into very, very specific sociology of work related content. Okay, is there a difference between this class and SOC 363? Yes, this class is for engineers. No, the content is very similar. I teach it a little bit differently when I've taught 363 in the past. A little bit more depth on the theories, and a little bit more, focus on slightly different themes that are interesting to sociology students instead of what I think will be interesting to people in engineering. Okay, if you didn't do, will my exams be open book? No, the exams are closed book. If you didn't do social 30-1, you are at a disadvantage. I'm gonna go with that's possible. But again, only for like the first week. And then we're gonna jump into things that are much less social studies-ish. Okay. So hopefully this is harder than social 10. Okay. I keep saying okay. Why do we keep saying okay? Oh. Sorry. For some reason, my computer got stuck, or the display got stuck on those 2 question slides and wouldn't move forward. There we go. Okay, so here we were. This is what we were talking about last time. So we started looking at this video on, one of the big shifts that happens historically, which is, the British looking for something that the Chinese want to acquire. If I'm right, we should.
In 1792, Britain has just come out of a war that's cost it not only much of its national treasury, but also one. In 1792, Britain has, and yet without the emperor wanted it, he would graciously accept out of respect for how far George had sent people just to pay him tribute. But no, China didn't need baubles or knickknacks from England, thank you. Trade would remain the way it was. So Britain was left with a massive trade deficit. The East India Company was £28 million in debt as a result of their war in India, and the royal coffers were nearly dry. They needed to find some product the Chinese wanted. And then they did. Opium. The treasury of the British Empire was flowing into China, and the Honorable East India Company was still reeling under the staggering debt it owed the government for underwriting its military conquests in India. Something needed to be done. They needed to find some tradable good, something other than silver, that the Chinese wanted to import to offset the massive costs of the Victorian need for tea. And the answer they found was opium. By the early 1800s, tea sales in England were unimaginably high. Given the quantity they were importing, the average English household spent about 5% of its income just on tea. The government itself was basically propped up by the tea trade. Because the government had lent the Honorable East India Company so much money to conquer parts of India, and because a huge portion of the East India Company's revenue came from transporting tea from China, the country was even more dependent on the tea trade, as that revenue was being used not only to repay the debt the company had incurred, but to pay interest on it. But even as the tea craze was consuming England, the Honorable East India Company was also coming to the realization that their conquests in India weren't realizing the returns they'd hoped. Their plans to grow cotton in India had gone awry as cotton production in the Americas, and especially in Egypt, were on the rise. But it turns out that something else grew really well on all that land that they'd planned to use for cotton: poppies. So the East India Company found its solution. They would grow poppies in India, convert them into opium, sell that at a profit in China, use the profit to buy tea, and then sell that at a profit back in Britain. There were only a few problems with this plan. Besides the fact that it meant pushing drugs on an unheard-of scale, there was also the issue that opium was technically illegal in China. And the Honorable East India Company, being of course the Honorable East India Company, would never do something illegal. Okay, they would, but they didn't want to risk getting kicked out of China or cut off from its tea. So they set up a market in Calcutta, basically the part of India closest to China that they controlled. And they said, anybody who wants to buy opium, we're selling it right here. No idea what you might want to do with it, but hey, that's not our business. Who wants some opium? Come on. And then they would let the smugglers handle it from there. So now you've got a bunch of dodgy characters selling drugs in the Middle Kingdom, basically backed by the largest corporation and the largest national economy in the world. And as Indian opium turned out to be even stronger than the domestically grown stuff, everybody wanted it. So opium sales skyrocketed, and by 1835 they were moving roughly 3,064,000 pounds of opium per year into China. And that number was only going to get bigger, because in 1833 the British government decided to finally do away with the Honorable East India Company's monopoly on the opium trade. Now everybody wanted a piece of the action, and opium started flowing into China completely unregulated, increasing supply, driving prices down, and making the substance even more accessible. By 1839, nearly 5,639,000 pounds of opium would be pouring into China every year. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because it's not like the Chinese were just sitting around letting this happen. As piles of money which the government desperately needed flowed out of the country, the emperor appointed an official named Lin Zexu to address the disastrous effects of opium on the country. He was brilliant, incorruptible, and utterly inflexible. He saw the threat of the West and the morally corrupting effect that opium had had on the Chinese people, and decided that the only approach to take was the complete removal of opium from China. By March of 1839, he had reached Canton. It was the source of all this opium, so he planned to cut it off at its source. His actions were swift and uncompromising. He arrested thousands of Chinese opium traders, forced addicts into rehabilitation programs, confiscated opium pipes, and closed opium dens. And then he took on the Western traders. At first, he wrote an open letter to Queen Victoria, appealing to her conscience, a letter which it's very likely she never received. When he got no reply, he demanded that the foreigners surrender their stores of opium. The foreign merchants stalled and prevaricated, giving up small amounts of their opium stock, but nowhere near what Lin Zexu had demanded. So he marshaled the troops and put the foreign warehouses to siege. The merchants holed up for a month and a half, but in the end they gave in, and were forced to surrender 21,000 chests of opium. For the next 23 days, Zexu burned the opium with lye. This was a king's ransom in opium. The amount of money this destruction represented is staggering. It was roughly 1/6 as much as the British Empire, the largest, most far-flung empire in the world, had spent on its military the previous year. Needless to say, everybody involved was going bankrupt. Now, there is some debate over whether the Chinese offered tea in exchange for the surrendered opium, but what is certain is that the merchants never received any tea, and instead the local chief superintendent of British trade, one Captain Charles Elliot, promised the merchants that the British government would cover their losses if they would leave peacefully. Which, of course, the British government absolutely refused to do. The outcry over this illegal seizure of British goods began to grow. Meanwhile, back in China, a reprehensible incident occurred where some drunken British sailors beat a man to death. Lin Zexu demanded the execution of a British sailor in recompense. Captain Elliot, who actually disliked the opium trade and was somewhat sympathetic to the Chinese situation, put out a reward for evidence of who had committed the murder, and gave money to the victim's family. He then had the criminals tried on his ship, inviting Lin Zexu or a representative to witness the proceedings, although none took him up on the invitation. He sentenced the men to hard labor back in England, but this wouldn't work for Lin Zexu. After all, the whole point of his demand was to show that foreigners couldn't just violate Chinese law on Chinese soil. So in response, he stopped all food being supplied to the British and posted signs telling them that frothier water sources had been poisoned. Next, he ordered the Portuguese to eject all British from Macau. He was going to see these pesky British and their drugs off Chinese soil once and for all. So the British retreated to a barren nothing island off the coast. A barren nothing island that will eventually be known as Hong Kong. Their food crisis was at a head, though. Captain Elliot sent a request for food sales to resume. The response was delayed, so he sent men ashore to buy food. But as they were heading back, these provisions were seized by Chinese officials. Soon, a firefight broke out between the blockading Chinese junks and the British ships, and thus began the First Opium War.
Okay, so, and it's an interesting story whereby, the Chinese are defeated by the British and then a bunch of other European powers that also make a bunch of money selling opium. And this, brings a ton more revenue in for these European empires that they use to fuel further industrialization, right? For centuries, money had essentially been flowing from Europe. Gold and silver had been flowing from Europe into China. And the opium trade, and eventually they fight two different opium wars against the Chinese to keep that silver and gold flowing back into the West, which in large part allows them to continue funding their far-flung empires, which, as the video kind of suggested, the British one was near bankruptcy, and stops constant kind of capital flows out of the West. Okay. I can turn the lights down a little bit. Did my live stream die because I'm streaming unallowed content? Okay, I fixed it. Okay, there we go. Okay, no, we won't watch that again. Okay, so what else is interesting about the Industrial Revolution in terms of work? So it is obviously an era of rapid economic and social change, right? You basically dismantle the whole system of European industry and production that happened during the Middle Ages and rebuild it along industrial lines. There's also a rapid reorganization of European societies. People go from living on those family plots, that their families had farmed for centuries, to moving into the nascent industrial cities. Right, so this is, spurred by these large pools of capital from these merchants and banks and trades in things like opium and cotton and tobacco and sugar that the Europeans first start buying and processing in Europe, and then they obviously start selling stuff all over the world into any market that will take it, and a bunch of developments in Europe that allow for the creation of factories. And amongst these are new sources of energy. Because along with industrialization, Europe undergoes an energy revolution, shifting primarily from things like wood to an animal power to coal and things like the steam engine. Now, this, if you look at the history, this energy transition actually starts a little bit after industrialization, which is why if you go to England, right? Okay, so here, you've probably all read Robin Hood, right? Or you've seen Robin Hood movies. And so you know that there is in Robin Hood this great thing called Sherwood Forest where Robin Hood hides. If you go to England today, there are basically no big forests left. Because what happens is to fuel industrialization, the British cut down basically every damn tree on the island nearly to basically get industrialization going, because the best source of energy they have is wood. But eventually they discover coal. Well, they knew coal was there, but they start mining coal and using it for industrialization. So, like in a lot of other places, like Germany, you still have great big forests. In England, you really have none because the English used all of those forests to fuel industrialization. Okay, now this brings about a couple of things. So, obviously, rapid urbanization. Along with, a bunch of laws, like in England, they start with what's called the Enclosure Act, which basically takes all of those big agricultural estates that have been worked by peasants, kicks all of the peasants off of those lands, and said, these belong to the feudal lords, you have to leave. So all of those people are looking for places to live and ways to support themselves, and they move into these rapidly industrializing cities. Places like London, Birmingham, and Manchester in the UK, in Scotland, places like Glasgow and Edinburgh. So you have rapid urbanization, the massive kind of explosion in the size of cities, and with that, a lot of misery because you get an impoverished urban working class. You also have what's called the de-skilling of work. So, amongst other things, factory work ends up being relatively low skill, especially once you start breaking things up, in terms of divisions of labor, where you have different people in charge of different parts of the production process. So you will get really good as a worker at one task, right? Tightening that one bolt, doing that one weld, doing a set of stitches on a piece of clothing. But mostly you're in charge of one thing, and then it moves on to someone else who does the other parts. So each part of that task becomes less and less skilled. And then, what you get is massive changes in gender division of labor and eventually an idea of the family wage. So what basically happens, like if you go back to, an agricultural society, labor is relatively evenly split, right? Women and men on farms both do different jobs, right? But they're both active in running the farm. Men will tend to do the more physically demanding tasks. Women will tend to do, along with caring for children and elderly relatives, more of the less physically demanding tasks. The factory system obviously changes this in major ways. At least initially, manufacturing does prize a lot of strength, right? A lot of the tasks are physically demanding, so a lot of those factory jobs are really, really well suited for men. Women, on the other hand, kind of have to split their labor a little bit differently. A lot of it continues to be, some of it's done in factories, but a lot of it ends up being done out of the home, and tasks that women can kind of do while they are, caring for children as well, because we're still talking about an era where there is, no birth control to speak of. So you get things like what's called the putting out system, where say the cloth is produced in factories and cut and then sent to women where in their homes with their sewing machines, they put those things together into, they sew the shirt, they sew the pants in their home and then sell those finished products back to the factories for, usually on a piecework basis. So if you get, if you sewed 6 shirts together, you get paid for 6 shirts or whatever it happens to be. But it changes these kind of balances. Women have much less to do economically because the factory system so prizes sort of physical tasks that demand male bodies, principally. Okay, can I dim the screen? That one's a good question. I don't think I can dim the screen. The screen is set to bright. Maybe I can dim my laptop. I don't know if that'll help. I am at minimal lumens, I think. More brightness? Less brightness? Yeah, sorry, that's the best I can do. The projector is set to burn out your corneas. I'm sorry. The li- Did I fix that? Live stream. Well, I will assume that I fixed that. Okay. Alrighty. Okay. So, lots of other things that happen, right? We get lots of social disruption out of the Industrial revolution, because again, it is transforming the way things are made and taking away the livelihoods of a lot of people um, who used to make a living, producing stuff in their homes or in kind of small workshops. So I talked about the Enclosures Act already because I'm, sometimes get ahead of my slides. The other things that happens though is these low-skilled factory workers come to displace skilled artisans, right? So if you had gone back to the Middle Ages, someone who produces shoes, right? Well, it would have been a cobbler. And these were highly skilled people who would, cut the leather for shoes, sew it all together, whatever. I don't know. I've never studied shoe assembly, so I don't know all the steps in the shoe assembly process. But it was a highly skilled trade. And producing a pair of shoes would have taken one person, a relatively long time. The factory system is really good at producing a lot of shoes, right? It makes a ton of shoes much more quickly than a single artisan, partially by splitting up the tasks that each person does. So, one person cuts the leather, one person, sews this on, one person puts the laces on or whatever, again, not a scholar of the shoe production system. So what ends up happening very quickly is factory produced goods, and this is all sorts of things like clothing, shoes, metal goods, right? Anything that can be produced in factories essentially starts to push all of these skilled artisans out because it dumps these goods on the market at considerably lower cost, right? So things produced in a factory are going to be much cheaper to produce than things produced by this skilled artisan who goes through the entire process, and it takes a really, really long time. Europe had this system of established kind of guilds, right? They were basically these skilled artisans would get together in guilds, where they would regulate their trades, train new people, and all sorts of things like that. And the guilds come to the conclusion that this new factory system is going to destroy their livelihoods, which it eventually does. So, what do they do? Between 1811 and 1813, these skilled traders basically get together and decide that what they're going to do is go into these factories and break them, basically to save their livelihoods. And for whatever reason, the nature or the origin of the word is lost to history. But this group in England who decides to smash the machine works comes to be known as Luddites, right? Now, there's some story that maybe they were led by a young man named Ludlum, and so they all took on the name Luddite, but we don't really know. Most of those stories are apocryphal. Now, the British government, obviously getting a lot of tax revenue from and advantages from this industrial system is having none of it. So they send in the British Army. The British Army captures these Luddites and puts them in, either exiles them to the colonies. So not a small number of them end up in Australia, imprisoned, because Australia to some extent is a penal colony. Some of them are just imprisoned in England, and some of them are executed. Now, Luddite is still a word we use today. If you find someone who is technologically resistant, you might still have someone call them a Luddite. Okay, another fun apocryphal story, this time from the Netherlands, is that the word sabotage supposedly has its origin in this period as well. And as the story goes, is that these same kind of skilled tradesmen in the Netherlands went into these factories and threw their wooden shoes that were called sabots into the machine works to break them, from which we get the word sabotage, right? So again, that is probably apocryphal, so it's probably not true, but it is a widely circulated kind of story. Okay. So, industrialization, what do we have? New technologies and energy sources. So, coal, steam, I guess the other one that they replaced was water wheels, right? In the medieval period, they used a lot of water wheels and windmills for power. So they got rid of those in favor of, more efficient sources like coal. And you get, machines that come out of that that produce that energy. And the most important one is the steam engine, right? The steam engine is ultimately fairly transformative and will be, sort of the dominant way of turning coal into power for, the better part of a century. You get factories, right? And that putting out system I described, where certain tasks are sent out to, especially jobs that are done by women are sent out to homes where they complete those things and then sell them back on the basis of piecework. Of course, factories are way more efficient than these, trade guild, someone in their home cobbling together a cobbled thing. Oh, I just lost my microphone. Okay. I snagged it. That hasn't happened in a while. Okay, I'm back. Woo. So you get that increase in production, right? And European society surges ahead of the rest of the world in production because they can make things so much more quickly. And eventually, you get a rise in the standard of living as well. And that rise in the standard of living starts with the merchants and the elites, and then very slowly kind of trickles its way into the working class as well. But by the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, the standard of living, even for the working class, is considerably higher. And we see this, in some ways, in terms of nutrition, right? The average person in the European working class has almost double the calories that the average person worldwide has, right? So they're eating twice as many calories because they can afford them, and those calories are available. Okay, and this is also paralleled by a couple of other things, and we're going to talk about these things through the course. I talked about urbanization as well, but the other one that starts to appear is managerial control. As these enterprises get more and more complicated, they start to need specialized people to run them, right? So you get the emergence of what you would call white collar workers, right? So you get this distinction between blue collar, those that are wearing principally denim, right? A tough material that's good for working, and white collar, which is more like your office workers, right? So you get the rise of a managerial class. And this itself is good as well. Because and Weber talks about this, what ends up happening is that this managerial class starts to be quite educated, quite literate, very, very skilled, and so they demand higher wages. And they get, although they're not, part of the merchant class or the class that owns the factories, they start to see their standards of living rise because they're needed to run things. And you get the emergence also of a large and powerful bureaucracy, both at the government level, but at the level of specific industries, where you need specialized bureaucrats or specialized people who are able to run these companies. Okay, so that's industrialization. Industrialization, at least until, kind of the rise of the Soviet Union, really goes along with capitalism as well, though they are not synonymous necessarily. So capitalism, obviously the system that we live under economically. So it is a social system of production, distinct from feudalism and socialism, where you have things like a labor market. And in the labor market, you have wage laborers who create value and who sell their labor essentially for some kind of recompense. And this will become a big question for like Karl Marx, because he suggests that these people, all they have is their labor. And he thinks that's a problem, right? All you have is what you can do with your body. And owners, who control the means of production, right? Who works and how the work is done. And so, I mean, when we get to Marx, we'll talk about this, but he calls these folks, the proletariat. And these are, the bourgeoisie. I think I spelled that right. And, for in Marxist terms, these are the baddies and these are the goodies. So we'll talk about that as we go through. Okay, so I'm going to show you a brief clip here, or else it won't be too long. Um, this is from a movie called Modern Times. So it's a Charlie Chaplin film. So it's a silent film, but it's kind of interesting in illustrating, what that factory system would have looked like and how, I guess in a sense, dehumanized it was, and how de-skilled it was. So just kind of pay attention as we watch this. And obviously, this is played in large part for laughs because it's Charlie Chaplin. The kind of tasks that Chaplin is being asked to do, how repetitive they are, and how boring and dehumanizing it would be.
Attention foreman. Trouble on bench 5. Check on the nut tightness. Nuts coming through loose on bench 5. Attention foreman. Back. Section 5. More speed. 4-7. Relief man passing. Relief man passing. Hey! Quit stalling. Get back to work. Go on.
We get the idea, right? Pretty dehumanized, not a lot of space for, humanity or going to the bathroom or having a cigarette. And it's not until much later that a lot of the things that we think of as, normal parts of work, like a lunch break and a coffee break, emerge. And a lot of it actually comes out, specifically of kind of sociological studies of work, trying to find ways to make things more productive. Okay, so a couple more points here, and then we'll start on concepts and theories. So Canada, where does Canada sit in this? Well, Canada is a relatively late industrializer, right? So of the kind of Western countries, Canada up until Confederation, right? So Confederation, hopefully you remember this, is 1867. But until Confederation, Canada is basically just a resource base for, first England and then the United States. And it goes through different phases. but produces things like fur, timber, fish, minerals, wheat coming out of the prairies, and all of that stuff. The population is extremely rural, right? Most people don't live in the cities. The Canadian cities at Confederation are relatively small, and Canada, is marked by a lot of immigration, and that will pick up after Confederation to a major extent. So it's very much a kind of pre-industrial society prior to 1867. The main occupations for men would be farming, fishing, lumbering, and the fur trade, and for women, domestic tasks, canning, gathering eggs, and doing making cheeses, and kind of doing things like sewing. Now, again, one of the things that happen, and this is interesting, we'll talk about this more when we talk about women's work in the course. A lot of the tasks, especially that are done by women, once industrialization, like all of this is important economic activity. Once industrialization takes over those things, women are left with a lot less to do and a lot less means of contributing economically, which is where eventually you'll get the push to get women involved in the labor force in major ways. Okay. So, at Confederation, half of Canadian workers worked in agriculture, right? So that would be like if half of you ended up working on farms, right? So that is a pretty low number. Now, one of the projects of, Sir John A. Macdonald and the kind of fathers of Confederation in Canada is to rapidly industrialize Canada. And a big, this seems timely, a big reason for this was that Macdonald was concerned that if Canada remained just this resource base for the United States and didn't have an industrial base of its own, that Canada would eventually just be swallowed up by the United States, right? That its economy wouldn't be able to keep up and it wouldn't have the ability to, say, resist any kind of American incursion. Specifically, in the western part of Canada, this is a huge concern. So, I say it's timely because I feel like we're facing this again with Donald Trump. Okay, so one of the big projects post-Confederation is to get Canada industrialized, right? And Macdonald and the Canadian founders do this in a couple of ways. One of the big ones is to try and attract both British but more American capital investment. So you get the establishment of kind of branches of American corporations in Canada. A little bit later, we'll see this, and probably the biggest surviving example of this is the US automakers, right? We still see General Motors, Ford, and what's left of Chrysler under the Stellantis brand today, with branch plants, that's Chrysler, Dodge, right? All of those kind of former brands that were under, Chrysler, is called Stellantis now. Those still exist, but this was a big strategy for Canada to get industrialized by bringing in these American firms that could produce goods cheaper in Canada because they were paying Canadian wages at a lower rate than American wages. Okay, you get the first factories actually in the Maritimes, right? Because they're very close to ocean-going shipping. Though eventually you also get a lot of, just because of the population centers, of manufacturing in Quebec and Ontario. You have big projects to connect the Great Lakes to the St. Lawrence Seaway, which allows Ontario to become a major manufacturing hub because you can move things by ship. The completion of things like the Canadian Pacific Railway are big as well. And then you get big manufacturing of manufactured goods, especially textiles. So textiles is clothing, right? Clothing and other kind of woven goods. So everything from like tablecloths and sheets to the clothing that you wear, that's all textiles. And Quebec and Ontario get really good at manufacturing those things. And strangely, textiles is always one of the first industries places get when they start to industrialize for whatever reason. I guess people need a lot of clothes. And you still see that, right? China, when it started industrializing, one of its first industries was textiles. And if you look at somewhere like Bangladesh, today, right, the biggest industry in Bangladesh is the clothing industry or the textiles industry. So textiles end up being an important part of most countries' industrializing journeys. Okay, this again kind of splits things along gender lines where men go to work in factories, and you start to get this idea of kind of men being in the public sphere, women mostly inhabiting the private sphere, and that eventually, this idea that men should be able to earn what's called like a family wage, right? That men's income should be enough to support, a wife and children at home who aren't economically active. Though we actually don't see that happening until about the 1920s. So it takes a long time, right? More than a century into industrialization before it's realistic that men can actually support, a wife and kids at home. And it actually doesn't last that long because by the 70s, that really starts to fall apart. Okay. So so from I should go back one thing. By 1900, right, so Canada went from basically zero to by 1900 ranking 7th amongst the industrial manufacturers in the world, right? Now Canada today, in terms of like its economy, ranks about 10th, 9th or 10th, depending on how you measure it. So Canada has maintained this position for a pretty long time of, despite being a relatively small country, not by landmass, but by population, actually being pretty successful economically. And this is, the legacy of people like Sir John A. Macdonald. Okay, so what does this look like? Well, you have the rapid industrial expansion with all of the problems that, that causes. So Canada goes through an industrial kind of expansion that's much quicker even than what, say, the United States, England, Germany, France went through, because it goes essentially from nothing, right, in, let's say, 1870 to 30 years later being the 7th largest industrial economy in the world. So it's very rapid and it dislocates things a lot. You have the rise of scientific management, and we are going to talk about scientific management a lot. Scientific management is this, really interesting thing, and like I said, your kitchen, the shape of your kitchen today is largely owing itself to scientific management. But it's basically people saying, science has been really good at, growing food, extending lifespans, making medicines, and all sorts of things. It would probably be really good if we studied workers at figuring out how we could, make their work much more efficient. Now, trust me when I say scientific management, when the principles of scientific management are applied, workers often hate it, right? Because it feels very inorganic. Okay, we also have a ton of labor unrest, especially in this period from 1900 to 1930. There's sort of global movements for workers' rights, for better compensation, for safer working conditions, for things like weekends and vacations and lunch breaks and coffee breaks, where workers, start to push back. And you get, in Canada, between 1900 and 1914, 400 strikes and lockouts in Ontario alone. We'll talk about this again later in the course. You have things like the Winnipeg General Strike, where striking workers basically shut down the entire city of Winnipeg, which, at the time was one of Canada's larger cities. So they shut down the entire city, essentially. Okay, and you have high levels of immigration. Basically, Canada doesn't have enough workers to feed these growing industrial centers and the demand for manufacturing. So it imports people from around the world, mostly at this point from Europe, right? The Irish, Italians, Poles, and anyone from the British Isles are the favorite immigrants. But you also get a lot of people coming from China to work, specifically, starting in Vancouver, to work on the railroad and to connect, East and West Canada through the Canadian Pacific Railroad. And the working conditions are poor, especially on the railroad. At one point, they say that for every kilometer of track, one Chinese worker died building the Canadian Pacific Railroad. That's how dangerous a lot of the work was. And little protection for labor, which is where you end up with all of this labor unrest. Okay, and you start to get, the emergence of larger and larger corporations, setting up these factories, managing the work, and all of that stuff. And some of Canada's, fine corporations that are still around today find their origins in this period. So you can think of like Bombardier, if you want to call them a fine corporation. My favorite one is McCain's, right? The French fry people. They also have their origin in this period. Oh, as do one of the other ones, the Molsons, right? The ones who produce the less than average beer and far below average hockey teams. Yes, that is a shot at my beloved Montreal Canadiens, who I am a great fan of and love, but God, the management of the Molsons of the Canadiens has been, shall we say, uneven at best. So you have these sorts of groups of what you might call Canadian aristocracies built up in this period. Okay, I think we're out of time and we're out of slides. So we will start talking about concepts and theories on Monday. A lovely weekend.